Imagine spending 14 years of your life walking from kingdom to kingdom, offering your wisdom to anyone who would listen. Imagine knocking on the doors of dukes and princes, explaining your vision for a better world, only to be politely ignored. Now imagine dying in obscurity, surrounded by a handful of students, convinced that everything you worked for had come to nothing. This was the life of Confucius. He never held lasting political power. He never commanded an army. He never saw his ideas implemented in any meaningful way during his lifetime. By every measure available to him, he failed. And yet, today, more than 2 billion people live in societies shaped by his teachings. His words have been memorized by more students than any other philosopher in history. Emperors claimed his blessing. Governments rose and fell based on interpretations of his texts. For over 2,000 years, the path to power in the largest civilization on Earth ran directly through his ideas. How does this happen? How does a man rejected by every ruler he approached become the ethical foundation for a quarter of humanity? How does failure of this magnitude transform into influence of this scale? The answer is not simple. It involves disciples who refuse to let his words die. It involves an empire that needed a philosophy to hold itself together. It involves the strange alchemy by which certain ideas, spoken at certain moments, refuse to disappear. But it also involves the man himself, his stubbornness, his clarity, his absolute refusal to compromise what he believed, even when compromise might have brought him comfort. If you are finding this journey through history meaningful, like this video and subscribe to the channel to help this channel bring more stories out of the shadows. And tell me, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Confucius was born in a time when the old world was dying. The great Zhou dynasty, which had unified China under a system of ritual and hierarchy for centuries, was collapsing. The kingdom had fractured into dozens of warring states. Warlords fought for territory. Nobles assassinated each other in their own courts. The ceremonies that had once bound society together were being abandoned or performed as empty gestures. Into this chaos came a boy who would become obsessed with one question. How do we live together without destroying each other? He would spend his entire life trying to answer it. He would travel thousands of miles, teach hundreds of students, develop a philosophy of extraordinary depth and practical wisdom, and he would die believing that none of it mattered. He was wrong. The ideas he planted would grow roots so deep that 25 centuries later, we are still living in their shade. His name in Chinese is Kong-Q, or with the honorific Kongfuzi, meaning Master Kong. Western missionaries would later Latinize this to Confucius, and under that name he would become one of the most famous human beings who ever lived. But fame came later. Much later. The man himself knew only the walking, the teaching, the closed doors, and the long silences of rulers who had no interest in virtue. This is not a story of triumph. It is something stranger. A story of how the right ideas carried by the right students can outlast every failure, every rejection, every death. But to understand how a failed political advisor became the conscience of a civilization, we must return to a world that was falling apart, and a boy who was born into its ruins. For centuries China had been held together by the Zhou dynasty, a system of rule that extended not just over territory, but over meaning itself. The Zhou kings claimed the mandate of heaven, a divine right to govern that came with divine responsibilities. They maintained elaborate rituals, ceremonies for planting and harvest, for war and peace, for the veneration of ancestors. These rituals were not decorations. They were the glue. When a lord performed the proper ceremony before battle, he was not merely following tradition. He was participating in an order that connected him to his ancestors, to heaven, to the very structure of the cosmos. When a son mourned his father in the prescribed way, he was not just grieving. He was affirming his place in a chain of obligation that stretched backward into the past and forward into the future. This was the Zhou system, and by the time Confucius was born, it was dying. The era in which he lived is known as the Spring and Autumn period, named after a chronicle of the state of Lu. The name sounds peaceful. The reality was anything but. The Zhou king had become a figurehead, powerless and ignored. The great lords who had once served him now fought each other with increasing brutality. What had been one kingdom fractured into over 100 competing states, each ruled by men whose only law was strength. The violence was constant. Armies crossed borders without warning, cities were sacked, populations were enslaved or slaughtered. In the courts, assassination became a common tool of politics. Sons killed fathers for thrones. Brothers killed brothers. Advisers who gave unwelcome counsel were executed. Those who flattered survived. The rituals continued, but they had become hollow. Lords performed ceremonies while planning murders. They invoked heaven while breaking every oath. The forms remained, but the meaning had drained away, like water from a cracked vessel. This was the world into which Confucius was born. World where the old ways were remembered but no longer believed. A world where power came from armies, not virtue. A world where everyone could see that something essential had been lost, but no one seemed to know how to recover it. Some responded to this chaos by embracing it, by becoming warlords themselves, by accumulating power through force. Others retreated from the world entirely, seeking peace in mountains and forests, abandoning society as beyond repair. Confucius would do neither. He would look at this broken world and ask a different question. What would it take to put it back together? Not through force. He had no army, not through withdrawal. He believed society could be saved, but through something subtler, something that began with individual human beings and radiated outward, through the cultivation of virtue, the restoration of ritual, the transformation of character. It was an audacious idea. It would take a lifetime to develop, and it would begin in the most unlikely of circumstances. A boy growing up without a father, in poverty, on the margins of a small and unimportant state, into this world of fracture and bloodshed, in the small state of Lu, a child was born, to a father who would die before the boy could remember his face. The man who would become the greatest teacher in Chinese history was born in the year 551 BCE, in the small state of Lu, in a town called Kufu. His father was Shu Lianghe, a minor nobleman and military officer. The historical records describe him as a man of unusual physical strength, the kind of soldier who could hold up a falling gate to allow his comrades to escape. He had served with distinction. He had earned respect. But he was old when Confucius was born, perhaps in his 70s, and his previous marriages had produced only daughters and one disabled son. Desperate for an heir who could continue the family line and perform the ancestor rites, Shu Lianghe took a much younger wife, Yan Zhengzai. She was perhaps 15 or 16 when she gave birth to the boy who would be named Kongqiu. The details of his early childhood are sparse. The records tell us that his father died when Confucius was very young, around 3 years old. This single fact would ripple through everything that followed. Consider what it means to grow up without a father in a society organised around ancestor veneration. The rituals that Confucius would later champion, the ceremonies of mourning, the obligations between generations, the careful attention to how the dead should be honoured, all of these assume a father who is present, who teaches, who models the proper way to live. Confucius had none of this. His father existed only as an absence, a story told by others, a grave that required tending but offered no guidance in return. When Confucius later insisted, with unusual intensity, on the importance of filial piety, the devotion of children to parents, he was not speaking from a place of comfortable experience. He was speaking from loss. The son who barely knew his father would spend his life building philosophical frameworks around that absence, trying to articulate what the relationship between parent and child should be, perhaps because he had never fully experienced it himself. His mother, Yan Zhengzai, suddenly found herself alone. She was young, she had a small child, and the protection that came with her husband's status had vanished. The records suggest that Shulianghe's family did not embrace her. Whether from social stigma, some accounts suggest the marriage was irregular, or from simple indifference, she was left to raise her son outside the orbit of his father's clan. This was precarious. In the hierarchical world of ancient China, a woman without a husband and a child without a father's family had few resources and little standing. The comfortable life that Shulianghe's position might have provided was not available to them, but Yan Zhengzai made a decision. She would not let her circumstances define her son's future. She would raise him herself. She would teach him what she could. And she would find ways, through determination, through whatever connections remained, to give him access to the education that might lift him beyond the poverty into which he had been born. She could not have known what that education would produce. She could not have imagined that the small boy she was struggling to feed would one day be remembered as the teacher of emperors. She knew only that he was curious, that he asked questions other children did not ask, and that he seemed drawn to the old ways, the rituals, the ceremonies, the half-forgotten practices that had once held the world together. His mother, now alone with a young child and no protection, made a decision. She would raise him herself. She would teach him everything, and she would refuse to let poverty erase his potential. They lived simply. The records do not give us details, but poverty in ancient China meant something specific: rough clothing, uncertain meals, manual labour from a young age. Confucius later recalled that in his youth he had been forced to take on many menial tasks. He said this not with shame, but with a kind of practical clarity. Necessity had taught him things that privilege never could. His mother did what she could. She seems to have taught him the basics of reading and writing, the foundational skills that any education required. But formal schooling in this era was reserved for the sons of the aristocracy. Tutors did not come to the homes of impoverished widows. The great archives of ritual and history were not open to children without connections. Confucius found another way. He asked questions. He asked everyone. He approached anyone who might know something about the old ways, the proper form of a ceremony, the correct words for a prayer, the reason behind a particular gesture in a funeral rite. He interrogated the elderly, who still remembered practices that younger generations had forgotten. He observed rituals wherever he could find them, and tried to understand not just what was being done, but why. This hunger for knowledge was not academic. It was existential. The boy growing up in a fractured world without a father, on the margins of a small state, was trying to understand how things were supposed to work. He was looking for order in a world that seemed to have lost it. What he found, piece by piece, was the system of the Zhou, the ancient rituals and hierarchies that had once unified China. To most people, these were relics, interesting perhaps, but irrelevant to the brutal realities of the present. To Confucius, they were a map. They showed what civilization had been when it functioned, and they suggested what it might become again if anyone cared enough to restore it. He was drawn to music, which in the Zhou system was not merely entertainment, but a moral force, a way of harmonizing the emotions, of attuning the soul to proper feeling. He studied the ancient songs, the folk poetry that had been collected and preserved, finding in them not just beauty but instruction. He was drawn to history, to the records of kings and ministers who had governed well or poorly, whose choices had led to flourishing or catastrophe. He treated the past not as a dead thing, but as a teacher, full of examples and warnings. And above all, he was drawn to the rituals themselves, the intricate ceremonies for every occasion, from the crowning of a king to the mourning of a parent. Other boys his age might have found these tedious. Confucius found them fascinating. Each gesture meant something. Each word had been chosen for a reason. The rituals were a language, and he was determined to become fluent. His mother watched this strange child. This boy who would rather discuss funeral rites than play with other children, this son who was teaching himself what no one would teach him. She did not fully understand what he was becoming, but she could see the intensity, the focus, the refusal to accept the limitations that poverty had placed around him. He was fascinated by one thing above all, the rituals of the Zhou dynasty, the ancient ceremonies that had once held civilization together. While other boys played, he was memorizing the proper way to mourn the dead. When Confucius came of age, he did what poor young men have always done. He looked for work. The positions available to someone of his station were not glamorous. He became a clerk. He managed a granary, keeping records of how much grain came in and how much went out. Later, he supervised livestock, counting cattle and sheep, tracking births and deaths in herds that belonged to wealthier men. These were jobs that others might have performed mechanically, waiting for the day to end. Confucius approached them differently. Counting grain taught him precision. If the numbers did not match, something had gone wrong. Theft, waste, error. The system only worked when every measure was exact, when every record was honest, when every person in the chain did their job correctly. One careless clerk could corrupt the entire count. Supervising livestock taught him observation. Animals thrived or declined based on how they were treated, where they grazed, whether their keepers paid attention to, the details of their care. Neglect was visible. Competence was visible. The health of the herd was a verdict on the quality of the management. These were not philosophical insights in any grand sense. They were practical lessons, learned through repetitive daily work. But they planted something in his mind. Society itself was a kind of system. It functioned well when people performed their roles correctly, when records were accurate, when obligations were honoured. It deteriorated when people improvised, when they cut corners, when they treated their responsibilities as burdens to be avoided rather than duties to be fulfilled. The rituals he had been studying on his own were, in a sense, the social equivalent of granary records. They were precise instructions for how to act in every situation, how to greet a superior, how to serve at a banquet, how to conduct a sacrifice. When people followed them, interactions ran smoothly. When people ignored them, confusion and conflict followed. Confucius began to see ritual not as mere formality, but as technology. It was a set of tools that humans had developed over centuries to manage the complexities of living together. The tools had been refined through trial and error, encoded in tradition, passed down through generations. To abandon them, as so many in his era were doing, was to throw away the accumulated wisdom of the past. It was like burning the granary records and expecting the accounts to balance themselves. He was still young, still unknown, still working jobs that no one would remember, but something was crystallizing. The scattered pieces of his self-education, the rituals, the music, the history, the ancient poems, were beginning to form a coherent picture. He was developing a theory of how society worked and why it was failing. He did not yet have students. He did not yet have a platform. He was just a young clerk with unusual interests and an intensity that others probably found strange, but he was ready to move from observation to articulation, from private study to public teaching. But his real education was happening elsewhere, in temples, at funerals, in conversations with anyone who remembered the old ways. He was assembling piece by piece a vision of what society could be. She died when he was around 23 years old. The records do not tell us the cause, only that Yan Zhangzai, the woman who had raised her son alone in poverty, who had found ways to educate him against every obstacle, who had watched him become something she probably did not fully understand, was gone. What Confucius did next announced to everyone who was paying attention exactly who he was. He observed the 3-year mourning. In the ancient Zhou system, when a parent died, the child was expected to withdraw from ordinary life for 3 years. This meant wearing rough clothing, eating simple food, abstaining from music and celebration, living in a state of focused grief. The mourning period was not arbitrary. It was said to mirror the 3 years of infancy during which a child was utterly dependent on its parents. The debt of those early years could only be repaid by this extended dedication after death. By Confucius's time, almost no one followed this practice. It was considered impractical, excessive, a relic of an earlier age. People mourned briefly and moved on. Life was hard enough without adding 3 years of self-imposed deprivation. Confucius did it anyway. For 3 years he lived simply. He wore the coarse hemp garments prescribed by tradition. He refrained from the pleasures that others took for granted. He focused his attention on honouring his mother's memory in every way the ancient rites prescribed. This was not performance for an audience. There was no audience. He was a poor young man mourning a poor old woman. No one important was watching. No one would have blamed him for following the abbreviated mourning that had become normal. But Confucius understood something that others had forgotten. The rituals were not arbitrary rules imposed from outside. They were practices that shaped the soul of the person performing them. The 3-year mourning was not punishment. It was transformation. By living in that state of focused grief, by refusing to return immediately to ordinary pleasures, the mourner was changed. The relationship with the dead parent was honoured in a way that brief, perfunctory grief could never accomplish. By the time the mourning ended, Confucius was different. He had proven, to himself if no one else, that he was not merely someone who studied the old ways. He was someone who lived them. Around this same period, though the exact dates are uncertain, he married a woman named KUANG. She would bear him a son, Kong Li, also called Bo Yu. The records tell us almost nothing about this marriage. Confucius's teachings would emphasize the importance of family, the duties of husband and wife, the bonds between parent and child. But his own domestic life remains largely invisible to history. We know that he had a family. We know almost nothing about how he lived within it. What we know is that when the mourning for his mother ended, something had clarified. He had spent years studying the ancient rituals. He had worked humble jobs and observed how systems functioned. He had experienced in his own life the absence of a father and the presence of a devoted mother. He had proven his sincerity through the long discipline of grief. He was ready to teach. When the mourning ended, Confucius was no longer just a man who loved ancient rituals. He had become someone who embodied them, and he had decided what he would do with his life. He would teach. Around the age of 30, Confucius began to accept students. This sounds unremarkable. Teachers have always taken students. But in the world of ancient China, what Confucius did was quietly revolutionary. Education, in his time, was not a right. It was a privilege, one reserved almost exclusively for the sons of the aristocracy. The great schools were attached to noble courts. The tutors who taught ritual and music and history were employed by wealthy families to train their heirs. If you were born poor, you remained ignorant. The knowledge that governed society was kept behind walls you could not climb. Confucius opened a door in those walls. He announced that he would teach anyone who came to him with genuine desire to learn. He did not ask about family lineage. He did not require proof of noble birth. His single criterion was sincerity, a real hunger for knowledge, a willingness to struggle with difficult ideas, a commitment to becoming better than one was. The tuition he charged was flexible. Those who could pay, paid. Those who could not brought what they had. The famous story is that he asked only for a bundle of dried meat, the most basic offering affordable even for the poor. What mattered was not the payment, but the intention behind it. Students began to arrive, at first a handful, then more. They came from Lu and then from neighbouring states. Word spread that there was a teacher in Khufu who would educate anyone, who treated farmers' sons with the same seriousness as nobles, who seemed to believe that virtue was not inherited but cultivated. This belief was the foundation of everything Confucius taught. He looked at the chaos of his world, the violence, the betrayal, the collapse of the old order, and he saw the cause clearly. The men in power were not virtuous. They had inherited positions without inheriting the wisdom to fill them. Birth had given them authority, but birth could not give them character. The solution then was not to replace one set of unworthy rulers with another. It was to change the kind of person who could claim authority, to make virtue, rather than blood, the qualification for power, to demonstrate that anyone, given the right education, the right discipline, the right cultivation, could become what Confucius called an exemplary person. This was not democracy as we understand it. Confucius was not proposing elections or equal rights in any modern sense, but it was something almost as radical, the assertion that moral worth was independent of social position, that a peasant who cultivated himself could be more noble than a prince who did not, that the hierarchies which organize society should ultimately be hierarchies of virtue, not of birth. His school became a living argument for this principle. Students from different backgrounds studied side by side. They learned the same rituals, read the same texts, practiced the same disciplines. Some would go on to serve in governments. Others would become teachers themselves. A few would become famous, their conversations with Confucius recorded and preserved for millennia. But in those early years, the school was simply a gathering of young men around a teacher who believed in them, who believed that they could become something more than their circumstances had made them, who believed that the transformation of individual character was the first step toward the transformation of the world. Students began arriving from across Lu, and then from other states. He was teaching them something no one else was teaching, not just how to read, but how to become a certain kind of person. What exactly was Confucius teaching? At the heart of his philosophy was a concept so central that everything else orbited around it. The concept was Ren. Translators have struggled with this word for centuries. Benevolence, humanness, goodness, compassion, love. Each translation captures something, but none captures everything. Perhaps the closest English equivalent is this. Ren is what makes a person fully human. It is not a single virtue, but the source of all virtues. A person who possesses Ren naturally acts with kindness, with honesty, with respect. They treat others as beings worthy of care, not as tools to be used. They feel the suffering of others as if it were their own. When they encounter someone in need, they respond, not from calculation, but from an instinct as deep as the instinct for self-preservation. Confucius never provided a simple definition. When disciples asked him what Ren meant, he gave different answers to different people, tailoring his explanation to what each student most needed to understand. To one, he said, "Do not do to others what you would not want done to yourself." To another, Ren means loving others. To a third, the person of Ren, wishing to establish himself, helps others establish themselves. Wishing to succeed, he helps others succeed. These are not contradictions. They are facets of the same jewel, viewed from different angles. Ren was not a rule to be memorized, but a quality to be cultivated. A way of being in the world that had to be practiced, deepened, refined over a lifetime. Confucius believed that every human being was born with the capacity for Ren. It was not reserved for the elite or the educated. A peasant working in a field could possess it. A king on a throne could lack it. The difference was cultivation. Ren was like a seed that needed soil, water, light. Without proper conditions, it remained dormant. With the right care, it could grow into something that transformed not just the individual, but everyone around them. This is what education meant for Confucius. Not the accumulation of facts, but the cultivation of Ren. Not the mastery of information, but the transformation of character. A truly educated person was not someone who had read many books. It was someone in whom Ren had been awakened and developed. Someone who naturally, without effort, treated the world with the care it deserved. But here is where Ren becomes dangerous. If Ren is the measure of a human being, if it is what separates the truly noble from the merely powerful, then most rulers fail the test. The warlords carving up China were not men of Ren, The nobles assassinating each other in palace coups were not men of Ren. The princes who taxed their people into starvation while feasting in their halls were not men of Ren. Confucius was too careful to say this directly to their faces, but the implication was clear to anyone listening. His philosophy contained a judgment on the powerful, a judgment that said their power was illegitimate, their authority hollow, their claim to rule a lie. He was not calling for revolution. He was not training an army. He was simply teaching young men to recognize virtue when they saw it, and to recognize its absence. He was training them to look at the men who ruled their world and ask, do they possess Ren? Are they fully human? The answer, in most cases, was no. But Ren was not just about being kind, it had teeth. Because if treating others with full humanity was the goal, then most rulers, the violent, the selfish, the cruel, were failing at the most basic level of being human. Confucius needed a word for the person who had achieved Ren. He chose one that already existed, Junzi. In the language of his time, Junzi meant exactly what it sounded like. The son of a Jun, a lord. It was a term of social rank, not moral achievement. A Junzi was simply an aristocrat. You were born a Junzi or you were not. Confucius took this word and performed a kind of philosophical theft. He kept the term but changed its meaning entirely. In his teaching, a Junzi was no longer someone born into the right family. A Junzi was someone who had cultivated virtue to the point of excellence. The word that had meant son of a lord now meant exemplary person. This was linguistic revolution disguised as education. When Confucius spoke of the Junzi, he spoke of a standard that anyone could achieve. The Junzi was calm in crisis, because they had disciplined their emotions. They were honest even when lying would be easier, because they valued their integrity above comfort. They treated those below them with respect, because they understood that all people possessed dignity. They studied constantly, because they knew that wisdom was never complete. The Junzi was not arrogant. Arrogance was the mark of someone who had stopped growing, who believed they had arrived at perfection when they had only glimpsed it from a distance. The true Junzi remained humble, aware of how far they had yet to travel, always learning, always refining. The Junzi was not passive. They engaged with the world, took on responsibilities, served in government when possible. But they did so on their own terms. They would not compromise their principles to please a corrupt ruler. They would not flatter to advance their careers. If serving meant betraying what they believed, they would resign and walk away. Their loyalty was to virtue, not to power. This was what Confucius was training his students to become. Not scholars in the modern sense. People who knew many things but did nothing with their knowledge. He was training them to be exemplary people, equipped to transform whatever situation they entered. A Junzi as a local official would govern justly. A Junzi as an advisor would counsel honestly. A Junzi as a teacher would educate with care. The role mattered less than the character filling it. But Confucius was clear, not everyone would make this choice. Alongside the Junzi he placed its opposite, the XIAO, the petty person. The XIAO was not necessarily evil in any dramatic sense. They were simply small. They thought only of immediate profit, of short-term advantage. They asked in every situation, what will benefit me? They measured success by wealth, by status, by the accumulation of things that could be counted. The XIAO saw relationships as transactions. They were kind when kindness paid, cruel when cruelty worked. They had no fixed principles, only calculations. They rose by flattery and survived by cunning. They might achieve power, might accumulate fortunes, might live long and comfortable lives. But they remained hollow. They had not become fully human. Confucius did not need to name the rulers of his era as XIAO. His students could see for themselves. The warlords competing for territory. The ministers scheming for advantage. The nobles who had inherited power without earning it. They were XIAO wearing the robes of Junzi. They held titles that meant nobility, but their souls were small. The Junzi had an opposite, the XIAO, the petty person. the one who thought only of profit and pleasure. And Confucius looked at the rulers of his age and saw Xiaoren everywhere. Small men with big armies, destroying a world they did not know how to repair. There was a question that Confucius returned to again and again. How do we live together without destroying each other? His answer was Li. The word is usually translated as ritual, but this misses its scope. Li encompassed everything from grand state ceremonies to the proper way to hand someone a cup. It was the entire architecture of correct conduct, the detailed instructions refined over centuries for how human beings should interact in every conceivable situation. How should a son address his father? Li provided the answer. How should a minister approach his ruler? Li specified the gestures, the words, the spacing between them. How should a host serve food to guests? There were proper sequences, proper bowls, proper placements. How should the dead be mourned? Li laid out every detail, the clothing, the duration, the sounds of grief. To modern ears, this sounds oppressive. Why should every action be governed by rules? Why should anyone care about the proper way to pour tea? Confucius would have answered, "Look around you. Look at what happens when people abandon the rituals." He had grown up in an age of chaos. He had watched states tear themselves apart, watched brothers murder brothers, watched rulers who had sworn oaths break them without hesitation. The old ceremonies were still performed, but they had become empty gestures, forms without meaning, words without weight. And the result was everywhere visible. Without shared rituals, people did not know how to treat each other. Every interaction became a negotiation, a power struggle, a potential conflict. Trust evaporated. Violence filled the void. Li for Confucius was the antidote. The rituals were not arbitrary. They were distilled wisdom, lessons from centuries of trial and error about how to coordinate human behavior. They told you what to expect from others and what others could expect from you. They reduced uncertainty. They created pockets of order in a disordered world. But Li was more than social lubrication. Confucius believed that performing the rituals correctly transformed the person performing them. When you mourned a parent with the proper rites, you were not merely following instructions. You were learning, in your bones, what it meant to grieve with dignity. When you served a guest according to proper form, you were cultivating the habit of respect. The outward actions shaped the inward character. This is why Confucius insisted on precision. A ritual performed carelessly was not neutral. It was corrosive. It taught the performer that the forms did not matter, that one could go through the motions without engaging the heart. This was exactly what had gone wrong with the rulers of his era. They performed sacrifices without sincerity. They spoke words of loyalty while planning betrayals. They had kept the external forms of Li while hollowing out their meaning. True Li required what Confucius called the rectification of the heart. The gesture and the feeling had to align. The form and the meaning had to match. A bow performed with genuine respect was lie. The same bow performed with hidden contempt was a lie. This was his vision for social order. Not force, not fear, but the voluntary adoption of shared rituals performed with sincerity. If everyone, from the lowest peasant to the highest king, internalized Li, society would stabilize without coercion. People would know their roles and fulfill them. Conflicts would be resolved before they began. The harmony that the Zhou dynasty had once achieved would return. He believed that if rulers would simply practice Li correctly, perform the rituals with sincerity, treat their subjects as the ancestors had taught, the violence would end. The kingdoms would stabilize. Order would return. It was a beautiful theory, and he was about to test it against reality. Philosophy, for Confucius, was never a monologue. It was a conversation. The ANALECTS, the text that preserves his teachings, is not a treatise. It is a record of dialogues, brief exchanges between a teacher and students who pushed him, questioned him, sometimes exasperated him. Without those students, we would have nothing. They were not merely recipients of wisdom. They were its co-creators. 3 disciples in particular shaped what Confucius became. The first was Yan Hui. Yan Hui was poor, poorer even than Confucius had been in his youth. He lived in a narrow alley, subsisting on a single bowl of rice and a single ladle of water. Others might have found this miserable. Yan Hui was serene. He possessed what Confucius most valued, a mind that grasped virtue intuitively, that needed only a hint before understanding completely. Confucius loved Yan Hui. It is not too strong a word. In the ANALECTS, the admiration is unmistakable. Confucius called him the one who came closest, to Ren. He said that he could speak with Yan Hui all day, and Yan Hui would never contradict him, not from civility, but because he understood so completely that disagreement was unnecessary. When other disciples accomplished something, Confucius praised them. When Yan Hui simply existed, Confucius felt hope for the world. The second disciple was different in every way. His name was Zilu. Before becoming a student, Zilu had been something like a bandit, rough, aggressive, proud of his physical strength. He came to Confucius wearing a sword and an attitude. He interrupted. He argued. He questioned whether all this talk of ritual and virtue had any point when the world respected only force. Confucius was patient with him. Zilu's courage was real, even if it was undisciplined. Confucius worked to refine it, to transform raw bravery into principled action. Zilu would never be smooth. He would never be diplomatic. But he was loyal beyond measure, and his willingness to fight made him useful in ways that gentler disciples were not. Their arguments became famous. Zilu would demand practical applications. Confucius would insist on foundations. Zilu would ask what to do about enemies. Confucius would reply that one should first cultivate oneself. The friction between them produced sparks that illuminated both. The third disciple was Zigong. Zigong was wealthy. He had made his fortune in trade, moving between states, negotiating deals, accumulating contacts. He was eloquent, charming, politically astute, everything that Confucius, in his blunt sincerity, was not. Where Confucius struggled to convince rulers, Zigong glided through courts with ease. Confucius valued Zigong's talents, but worried about his soul. Zigong was too clever, too smooth. He could speak beautifully about virtue without necessarily possessing it. Confucius pushed him to go deeper, to move beyond impressive words to genuine transformation. Their exchanges often had an edge, a challenge beneath the politeness. These 3, the saint, the soldier, the diplomat, represented different paths a student might take. Confucius did not teach them identically. He adapted his instruction to each personality, addressing what each most needed to learn. This was itself a teaching, that wisdom could not be delivered in a single formula. It had to be tailored to the person receiving it. They travelled with him, they protected him, they recorded what he said. Without them, Confucius would be a name without a legacy. Yan Hui once said that the more he studied under Confucius, the higher the teaching seemed, always just beyond reach, always pulling him forward. He never could have known how short his time to study would be. Confucius was once asked which virtue came first. His answer was immediate. XIAO. XIAO is usually translated as filial piety, the devotion of children to their parents. But the translation makes it sound passive, like simple obedience. Confucius meant something more active, more demanding, more alive. XIAO began with service. When your parents were alive, you cared for them. You attended to their needs. You respected their wishes, even when you disagreed. You brought them comfort in old age, repaying in some small measure the years they had spent raising you when you were helpless. When they died, XIAO continued, you mourned them properly, not briefly, not carelessly, but with the full weight of grief that their loss deserved. You maintained their graves. You performed the ancestor rites. You kept their memory present in the family, ensuring that the chain of generations remained unbroken. But XIAO was not merely backward-looking, it extended into the future. By honouring your parents, you taught your own children what honour meant. By maintaining the rituals, you gave the next generation a model to follow. XIAO created continuity across time. It wove individuals into a fabric that stretched from the distant past into the unknown future. Confucius believed that XIAO was the root of all other virtues. A child who learned to care for their parents had learned the basic grammar of human relationship. They understood obligation, sacrifice, duty. They had practiced from their earliest years treating another person's needs as seriously as their own. This training could then expand outward, to siblings, to friends, to neighbours, to rulers, to strangers. A person who had truly internalized XIAO would not be capable of cruelty. They would see in every human being a parent, a child, a sibling, someone who mattered to someone. The particularism of family would open, paradoxically, into universal care. This is why Confucius placed XIAO at the foundation. He was not simply endorsing traditional family values for their own sake. He was arguing that the family was the training ground for virtue. Get XIAO right, and the rest followed naturally. Neglect XIAO, and no amount of philosophy would compensate. The teaching carried special weight coming from him. Confucius had lost his father before he could remember. He had been raised by a mother who sacrificed everything for his education. When she died, he had mourned her for 3 years, not because custom demanded it, but because love demanded it. His teaching on XIAO was not abstract theory. It was autobiography. He expected his students to practice XIAO with the same intensity. Those who spoke of great ambitions but neglected their parents earned his contempt. What use was reforming a kingdom if you could not treat your own mother with respect? What use was studying virtue if you could not practice it in your own home? But there was an uncomfortable question lurking beneath this teaching. Confucius had a son. Kong Li was growing up while his father wandered from student to student, state to state, chasing a vision that always seemed just out of reach. What did filial piety mean in a family where the father was rarely home? A disciple once asked Confucius what he would do first if given charge of a government. The answer surprised everyone. Confucius did not say he would raise armies or collect taxes or build roads. He said he would rectify names. The disciple thought this was absurd. Surely there were more urgent matters than words. Confucius disagreed. If names are not rectified, he explained, then language becomes confused. When language is confused, tasks cannot be accomplished. When tasks fail, rituals and music collapse. When rituals and music collapse, punishments miss their mark. When punishments miss their mark, people do not know where to stand. This doctrine, Zhengming, the rectification of names, was one of his most radical contributions. The idea seems simple. Things should be called what they actually are. A father should be called father, only if he acts as a father should. A ruler should be called ruler, only if he rules as a ruler should. If a man occupies a throne but governs through tyranny, calling him king is a kind of lie. The word confers legitimacy that his actions do not deserve. Confucius was diagnosing a sickness at the heart of his society. The language of virtue was everywhere, but the reality had vanished. Lords swore oaths of loyalty and broke them the next day. Ministers spoke of serving the people while looting them. The old titles, Duke, Minister, Lord, still circulated, but they had been hollowed out. They no longer meant anything because the people holding them no longer embodied anything. This linguistic corruption was not a symptom of social decay. Confucius argued it was a cause. When words lose their meaning, people lose their bearings. They cannot identify who is trustworthy because the language of trustworthiness is used by everyone, honest and dishonest alike. They cannot hold rulers accountable because the rulers have learned to speak as if they were virtuous, while acting as if virtue were irrelevant. The rectification of the names was a demand for honesty so radical it was almost aggressive. It meant that no one could hide behind titles. It meant that every claim to authority had to be earned demonstrated, proven through action. It meant that a scholar had the right, perhaps even the duty, to look at a powerful man and say, "You call yourself a ruler, but you do not rule. You call yourself a father, but you have abandoned your children. The name you claim is a lie." This was not safe. Rulers did not enjoy being told that their authority was illegitimate. Ministers did not appreciate being informed that their titles were undeserved. Confucius was giving his students a tool for critique, a philosophical knife sharp enough to cut through pretense. He was careful. He did not storm into courts and denounce kings to their faces. But the implication was always there, humming beneath his teachings. If names must match reality, then most of the powerful were frauds. The only question was whether anyone in power would ever listen to a teacher who offered such uncomfortable truths. This teaching made Confucius extremely useful to rulers who wanted reform, and extremely dangerous to rulers who did not. In the state of Lu, someone was finally ready to give him real power, and Confucius was about to learn what happens when philosophy meets politics. For 20 years Confucius had taught. He had developed his philosophy, trained his disciples, built a reputation that extended beyond the borders of Lu. But he had never held real power. He had never been able to test his ideas against the resistance of the actual world. Around 500 BCE, that changed. Duke Ding of Lu appointed Confucius to a government position. The exact sequence of roles is debated by historians, but he rose quickly, first to a magistracy in the city of Gyeongdu, then to Minister of Works, and finally to Minister of Crime. He was approximately 50 years old. After a lifetime of preparation, he was finally in a position to act. The results were immediate. In Gyeongdu, he implemented policies based on his teachings. He established clear standards for burial practices, ensuring that the rich did not waste resources on extravagant tombs, while the poor left their dead unattended. He created systems of mutual responsibility among households, so that neighbours looked after one another. He emphasized education over punishment, rehabilitation over retribution. The city transformed. According to the records, lost items were returned rather than stolen. Disputes were settled before they became violent. People began to trust each other again. The changes were so striking that Duke Ding took notice and elevated Confucius to higher positions. As Minister of Crime, Confucius had authority over the entire justice system of Lu. He used it to shift the emphasis from punishment to prevention. He argued that if people were properly educated, if they understood the rituals and internalized the values they represented, they would not commit crimes in the first place. Prisons were for failures of education, not permanent warehouses for the condemned. He also began restoring the proper rituals at the state level. Ceremonies that had become perfunctory were revitalized. The relationship between the Duke and his ministers was clarified. For a brief, remarkable period, Lu began to resemble the kind of state Confucius had always described. Orderly, harmonious, governed by virtue rather than force. The neighbouring states noticed. Lu was a small state surrounded by larger and more powerful rivals. The most dangerous of these was Qi, directly to the north. Qi had been accustomed to treating Lu as a minor nuisance, a state too weak to resist pressure. But now something was changing. Lu was stabilizing. Its government was becoming more effective. Its people were becoming more unified. The advisors of Qi watched with growing alarm. A philosopher had taken charge of their neighbour's government, and instead of the chaos they might have expected, order was emerging. If Lu continued to strengthen, the balance of power in the region would shift. Confucius was making a small state into a potential rival through nothing more than good governance. They decided this could not be allowed to continue. In the courts of Qi, a plan began to take shape. They could not invade Lu. That would unite other states against them. They could not assassinate Confucius. That would make him a martyr. But they knew something about the Duke of Lu. Something about the weakness that lived in even rulers who wanted to be good. They knew he could be corrupted. For a brief shining moment it seemed like everything Confucius had taught might actually be true, that if rulers governed with virtue, order would follow naturally. But in the courts of Qi, a plan was being hatched. They knew they could not defeat Lu on the battlefield, so they would destroy it from within. The gift arrived with ceremony, 80 women selected for their beauty and trained in music and dance, 120 horses, magnificent animals bred for war and display. The state of Qi presented them to Duke Ding as a gesture of friendship, a tribute from one state to another. It was, of course, a weapon. The advisors of Qi understood what Confucius was trying to build in Lu. They also understood what would destroy it. A ruler attempting to govern by virtue needed to remain focused, disciplined, devoted to the demanding work of self-cultivation and good governance. A ruler distracted by pleasure would abandon all of it. Duke Ding accepted the gift. At first, Confucius may have hoped the damage would be limited. Perhaps the Duke would enjoy the entertainment and then return to his duties. Perhaps the horses would be a brief fascination. Perhaps the fundamental project of reform would survive a temporary indulgence. It did not. Duke Ding became consumed. The women danced. The music played. The horses were paraded. The Duke, who had been attending to government, stopped attending. Meetings were cancelled. Decisions were delayed. The careful rituals that Confucius had restored began to slip. The Duke was not hostile to reform. He was simply no longer present for it. Confucius waited. There was a crucial ceremony approaching, a state sacrifice that the Duke was required to perform. The ritual mattered not just symbolically, but practically. It was an occasion when the meat from the sacrifice was distributed to the ministers, a gesture that confirmed the bond between ruler and officials. If the Duke performed the ceremony correctly, it would signal that he had returned to his responsibilities. If he failed, it would signal the opposite. The day arrived. Confucius waited at the ceremony. The other ministers waited. The Duke did not come. For 3 days Confucius remained in Lu, hoping the Duke would recover, would remember, would return to the vision they had shared. The Duke remained with the dancers. On the 3rd day Confucius understood. He had built something real. He had demonstrated that his philosophy worked, that a state could be transformed through virtue, that order could emerge from chaos without violence, but that accomplishment rested on a foundation he could not control, the character of the ruler. Duke Ding had been willing to reform. He had not been strong enough to resist corruption. One well-placed gift had undone years of work. Confucius was not exiled. No one forced him out. He chose to leave. To remain in Lu would have meant watching everything he had built decay, participating in a government that had abandoned its principles, lending his reputation to a regime that no longer deserved it. In 497 BCE, Confucius left the state of Lu. He was 55 years old. He would not return for 14 years. Behind him lay the ruins of his greatest success, proof that his ideas could work, but also proof that they were fragile, dependent on conditions he could not guarantee. Ahead lay something he could not yet see, a world full of rulers who had heard of his ideas, who might have learned from what happened in Lu, who might be willing to try again. He would spend the next 14 years searching for such a ruler. He would not find one. In 497 BCE, Confucius left Lu. He was 55 years old. He would not return for 14 years. Behind him lay the ruins of his greatest success. Ahead lay something worse, a world full of rulers who had heard of his ideas and wanted nothing to do with them. The road out of Lu was not a retreat. Confucius did not think of himself as fleeing. He thought of himself as searching. Somewhere, he believed, there must be a ruler who would listen. Somewhere there must be a duke or a prince who genuinely wanted to govern well, who would recognize the value of what Confucius offered, who would have the strength to resist the corruptions that had destroyed Duke Ding. The world was full of states. Surely one of them would provide what Lu had not. He was wrong, but he did not know it yet. A small group of disciples travelled with him. Yan Hui, the brilliant one, who understood virtue intuitively. Zilu, the fierce one, who had argued with Confucius for years but would never abandon him. Others came and went as circumstances allowed. They were not an army. They were not even a proper entourage. They were a teacher and his students, walking from kingdom to kingdom, carrying scrolls and hoping for an audience. Their first destination was Wei, a state directly to the northwest. Confucius had contacts there, former students who had risen to minor positions, people who might facilitate an introduction to the Duke. He arrived with something like hope. The Duke of Wei received him. This was encouraging. A meeting meant a chance to explain, to persuade, to demonstrate the wisdom that had transformed Lu. But the Duke's interest quickly became clear. He asked about military formations. Confucius had spent his life thinking about virtue, about ritual, about the cultivation of character. He had nothing to say about how to arrange troops on a battlefield. He told the Duke that he understood the proper placement of ritual vessels, the sacred objects used in ceremonies, but he had never studied warfare. The Duke lost interest. This was the first rejection, but it established a pattern. Rulers wanted practical advantage, strategies for defeating enemies, techniques for extracting wealth, methods for consolidating power. Confucius offered something different. A transformation of values that would make such concerns secondary. He offered long-term stability through virtue. They wanted short-term victory through force. He stayed in Wei for a time, hoping the Duke would reconsider. He met with other officials. He continued teaching his disciples. But the appointment he sought never came. The Duke was polite, occasionally interested, never committed. Other states beckoned. Perhaps conditions would be different elsewhere. Perhaps a younger ruler, or a more desperate one, or a more virtuous one, would recognize what Confucius had to offer. The disciples followed. They had given up comfortable lives in Lu to walk these roads, to sleep in unfamiliar inns, to eat whatever food they could find. They believed in their teacher. They believed that eventually, somewhere, the right door would open. From Wei they travelled south, then east, then north again, a small band of philosophers walking from kingdom to kingdom, carrying scrolls instead of swords. In one of those kingdoms they would nearly die. The town of KUANG had suffered. Years earlier, a warlord named Yang Hu had attacked the region, leading troops that pillaged and killed. The people of KUANG remembered. They remembered his face. They remembered the terror. When Confucius arrived, someone looked at him and saw Yang Hu. The resemblance was apparently striking, close enough to trigger immediate recognition, close enough to ignite the hatred that had been waiting for an opportunity. Word spread through the town. The man who had destroyed their homes had returned. Before Confucius and his disciples understood what was happening, they were surrounded. Armed townspeople blocked the roads. There was no escape. The disciples were trapped with their teacher in a town that wanted them dead. 5 days. For 5 days they remained besieged. The townspeople were not professional soldiers. They were farmers, merchants, ordinary people with improvised weapons and long memories. But there were many of them, and they were angry. And the disciples were few. Zilu, the former bandit, was ready to fight. He had the temperament for it. But fighting meant killing innocent people who had made an honest mistake, and even if they broke through, they would be hunted across the countryside as murderers. There was no good option except to wait and hope that someone would recognize the error. Confucius did something unexpected. He picked up his lute and began to play. His disciples stared. They were surrounded by people who might kill them at any moment. Their teacher was making music. When they asked how he could be so calm, Confucius answered with a question of his own. The culture of the Zhou dynasty, he said, had been entrusted to him. After King Wen died, was not the preservation of that culture placed in my hands? If heaven intended this culture to be destroyed, then future generations would never have access to it. But if heaven does not intend its destruction, what can the people of KUANG do to me? This was either profound faith or profound delusion? Confucius believed that his mission was not merely personal ambition. He believed that the preservation of civilization itself depended on him, that heaven had selected him for this task, and that until that task was complete, he could not be killed by accident. The people of KUANG were making a mistake. Heaven would not allow that mistake to succeed. The music continued. Eventually, someone who actually knew what young Hu looked like arrived at the siege. The resemblance, they confirmed, was superficial. This old man with the lute was not the warlord. The siege dissolved. Confucius and his disciples walked out of KUANG unharmed. Whether the escape validated his faith or merely demonstrated his luck is a question the sources do not answer. Perhaps Confucius himself did not know. What he knew was that he had faced death calmly, that his teaching about the mandate of heaven had been tested, and that he was still alive. But this was not the worst trial the road would bring. The siege at KUANG was brief and resolved through clarification. What waited in the wilderness between CHEN and KAI could not be clarified away. The siege ended when someone finally recognized that Confucius was not Yang Hu. They released him. But this near-death experience was only a rehearsal for what waited between the states of CHEN and KAI, the moment when even his disciples would begin to doubt. The states of CHEN and KAI were small, weak, caught between larger powers. Neither could afford to have a famous philosopher advising their rival. When word spread that Confucius was travelling between them, both states sent soldiers, not to arrest him, not to kill him, simply to ensure he went nowhere useful. The soldiers found Confucius and his disciples in the wilderness and surrounded them. No one was allowed in or out. No food could pass. No supplies could arrive. The siege at KUANG had been a misunderstanding. This was deliberate. 7 days. For 7 days the food ran out and was not replenished. The disciples grew weak. Some could barely stand. They had followed their teacher across half of China, enduring rejection after rejection, believing that eventually the right opportunity would emerge. Now they were starving in a wilderness, prevented from reaching anyone who might help them. The anger began to surface. Zilu came to Confucius with a question that was also an accusation. Does the exemplary person also suffer such hardship? The words hung in the air. Zilu had always argued with his teacher, but this was different. This was the question that the journey itself had raised. If virtue was real, if heaven truly favoured the good, if Confucius's teachings were true, why was this happening? Why were they starving in a ditch while tyrants feasted in palaces? Why had every door closed in their faces? Confucius's answer came without hesitation. The exemplary person remains steadfast in hardship. The petty person in hardship loses all restraint. It was not a justification. It was not an explanation. It was a distinction. Suffering came to everyone, the virtuous and the vicious alike. The difference was in the response. The petty person, faced with adversity, abandoned their principles. They lied, cheated, stole, compromised everything they claimed to believe. The exemplary person, faced with the same adversity, held firm. They might fail, they might die, but they would not betray themselves. Zilu was not satisfied. The answer was philosophically coherent, but it did not fill an empty stomach. The disciples continued to weaken. Some stopped moving. The situation was becoming critical. Confucius called for his lute again. He began to sing, to play, to continue teaching as if they were not surrounded by soldiers, as if they were not starving, as if the circumstances were irrelevant to the work at hand. To the disciples who could still listen, he asked, "Am I a bitter gourd, fit only to hang on a string and never be eaten?" It was a strange question, half joke and half lament. A bitter gourd was useless, decorative perhaps, but providing no nourishment. Was that what he had become? A philosopher with perfect ideas that no one would implement? A teacher whose students learned everything except how to change the world? For the first time in the recorded dialogues, Something like doubt entered Confucius's voice. They survived, because allies finally broke through. But something had changed. For the first time, Confucius began to wonder whether heaven had abandoned him after all. He was getting old, his body was weakening, and every door he knocked on remained closed. The years blurred together. After the crisis between Chen and Kai, after they recovered their strength and buried their dead, the wandering continued. State after state, audience after audience. The same pattern repeated until repetition itself became the message. Confucius would arrive at a new capital. He would seek an introduction to the ruler. Sometimes the introduction came quickly. Sometimes it took months of waiting. When the audience finally occurred, he would explain his philosophy, the importance of virtue, the power of ritual, the transformation that proper governance could achieve. The rulers listened. Some were genuinely curious. They asked questions, debated points, seemed engaged with the ideas. Then they thanked him politely and returned to their wars. Others were less subtle. They found the old philosopher eccentric, entertaining in small doses, ultimately irrelevant to the serious business of power. They granted him an audience the way they might grant time to a travelling musician, a diversion, not counsellor. A few were hostile. They saw in his teaching an implicit criticism of everything they did. They heard the doctrine of the rectification of names and understood what it meant for rulers who ruled badly. They wanted him gone. None wanted him to stay. The specific rejections varied, but the result was uniform. Confucius was offering medicine that the sick refused to take. He was explaining to violent men why violence was counterproductive, to corrupt men why corruption was self-destructive, to short-sighted men why the long view was essential. They nodded, they sometimes agreed, and they continued exactly as before. His disciples aged alongside him. Some left to take positions in various governments, minor posts far from the centres of power, but at least employment. Others remained, walking the roads, sleeping in inns, growing older without growing close to their goal. Confucius himself was changing. The confident teacher who had left Lu was becoming something else. Not defeated exactly, but weathered. He spoke more often of heaven and less often of practical politics. He seemed to be making peace with the possibility that success would not come in his lifetime. He continued teaching. That never stopped. Wherever he was, whatever the circumstances, he taught. Students who could find him received the same careful instruction that students in Lu had received. The philosophy did not weaken because the philosopher was tired. If anything, the long years of rejection refined it, stripped away anything that was not essential, left only the core. But the political dream was fading. The vision of the virtuous state governed by wise rulers, a model that would inspire the world. It was not going to happen. Not through him, not in his lifetime. 14 years, dozens of states, hundreds of conversations, and nothing. In 484 BCE, Confucius received an invitation to return to Lu. He was 68 years old, he was tired, and he was finally ready to accept that his political dream had died. He returned to Khufu as an old man. The streets he had known as young clerk were the same, but he was not. 14 years of walking, of rejection, of near death and slow disappointment. They had changed him in ways that could not be undone. Shortly after his return, his son died. Kong Li, also called Boyu, was around 50 years old. He had lived his entire adult life in the shadow of a famous father who was rarely present. When Confucius was teaching students from across China, Kong Li was not among the favoured disciples. When Confucius was wandering from state to state, Kong Li remained in Lu, living the quiet life of an ordinary man. The historical records tell us almost nothing about their relationship. This silence may itself be meaningful. Confucius had spent decades teaching the importance of filial piety. He had insisted that the bond between parent and child was the root of all virtue, that a person who honoured their parents would naturally extend that respect to all of society. He had mourned his own mother for 3 years, demonstrating through personal sacrifice what proper grief looked like. But what kind of father had he been? The evidence suggests an absent one. During the years when Kong Li was growing up, Confucius was consumed by his mission. He was teaching students, seeking political appointments, developing the philosophy that would define Chinese civilization. Kong Li was there, presumably in the background, fed, housed, educated in the basic ways. But the intensity that Confucius brought to his disciples, the careful attention to each student's individual development, the years of close companionship on the road, Kong Li received none of this. When a disciple once asked Kong Li whether his father had given him any special private teachings, any secret wisdom reserved for family, Kong Li answered honestly, no. He had received the same instruction as everyone else. He had been taught to study the odes and the rituals, nothing more. This ordinariness seems to have been genuine. Kong Li was not stupid, not virtuous in any remarkable way, not vicious either. He was simply average, a man who happened to be born to an extraordinary father and who could not or did not rise to that level. When he died, Confucius mourned. He observed the proper rituals. He wore the appropriate garments. He followed every prescription he had taught others to follow. But when observers noted that his grief seemed restrained, that he was not weeping with the abandon that might be expected from a father losing a child, Confucius offered a response that has puzzled readers for centuries. He said that Kong Li had been an ordinary man. There was nothing exceptional to mourn exceptionally. Was this honest assessment or defensive distance? Was it the calm acceptance of a philosopher who had made peace with loss, or the rationalization of a father who had never been close enough to feel true devastation? The sources do not tell us. What they tell us is that Confucius buried his son according to proper form, that he continued teaching, that life went on. Perhaps this was simply what discipline looked like, the refusal to let personal grief overwhelm public responsibility. Perhaps it was something colder. The death of a child is unbearable. But Confucius was about to face a loss that would break him in ways even this could not. His son had been ordinary. Yan Hui was anything but. Yan Hui died first. The exact year is uncertain, probably 481 BCE, give or take. The cause is unknown. He was young, still in the prime of life, still the disciple who understood more deeply than any other. And then he was gone. Confucius wept. He did not weep as he had for his son. Restrained, measured, controlled by ritual. He wept without limit. The tears came and would not stop. His whole body shook with grief. The disciples who witnessed it had never seen their teacher like this. The man who taught equanimity, who embodied the calm of the exemplary person, who had faced starvation and siege with a lute in his hands, that man had vanished. In his place was an old man breaking apart. The disciples, unsettled, told him he was mourning excessively. Confucius turned on them. "Am I mourning excessively?" he demanded. "If I do not mourn excessively for this man, for whom should I mourn excessively?" Yan Hui was not his son. By blood, by duty, by the categories that organized, Confucius's own philosophy, Kong Li, should have mattered more. But the bond between teacher and student, when it reaches a certain depth, exceeds every other bond except perhaps marriage. Yan Hui had been more than a disciple. He had been proof that the teaching worked, proof that Ren could be cultivated, that an ordinary person could become extraordinary through discipline and learning. Proof that Confucius was not wasting his life, that the decades of rejection had not been pointless, because at least one human being had been transformed completely. Yan Hui was the living demonstration that the philosophy was true. Now the proof was dead. Confucius said, "Heaven is destroying me." He said it more than once in the days after Yan Hui's death. The word suggests something beyond ordinary grief. They suggest a man questioning whether his mission had been abandoned by the cosmos itself. For decades, Confucius had believed that heaven had entrusted him with the preservation of Jew culture. He had endured every rejection, every humiliation, every near-death experience because he believed the mission was real and that heaven would ensure its completion. The siege at KUANG, the starvation between CHEN and KAI. He had survived because heaven intended him to survive, but heaven had not protected Yan Hui. If heaven could take the best student, the purest embodiment of the teaching, the one who was supposed to carry it forward, then what did that say about heaven's intentions? What did it say about the mission itself? Confucius never answered these questions directly, at least not in the surviving records. He continued teaching, he continued working. But something had shifted. The confidence that had sustained him through the wandering years was cracked. And then Zilu died. The news came from the state of Wei, where Zilu had taken a position in a noble household. A political revolt had erupted. Zilu, brave and reckless as he had always been, had refused to flee. He had died fighting, killed in the violence that Confucius had spent his life trying to prevent. 2 disciples, 2 deaths, within months or years of each other. The sources are not precise about the timing, but the effect was cumulative. The inner circle was collapsing. The companions who had walked the roads with him, who had starved with him, who had argued with him and learned from him, they were dying, one by one, while he remained. He had outlived his son. He had outlived his greatest disciple. And now, as if heaven was still not finished with him, word came that Zilu, faithful, reckless, argumentative Zilu, had died too, killed in a political revolt. The violence Confucius had spent his life opposing had claimed another of his own. The old man kept teaching. Students still came to Qufu, young men who had heard of his reputation, who wanted to study with the philosopher whose ideas had transformed Lu before the dancing girls arrived, who believed that wisdom could be transmitted from teacher to student even when the world refused to listen. Confucius received them. He answered their questions. He demonstrated the rituals. He corrected their errors with the same patience he had shown decades earlier, before the wandering, before the deaths, before everything. But he no longer spoke of political appointments. The dream of a virtuous ruler, of a state transformed through moral governance, of a model that would spread across China, he had stopped pursuing it. Perhaps he still believed it was possible. Perhaps he simply knew it would not happen through him. Either way, the fire that had driven him from court to court for 14 years had banked down to something quieter. He spoke more often of heaven. In the ANALECTS, the later dialogues show a teacher who has shifted his attention. The discussions of government become fewer. The discussions of cosmic order, of the relationship between human virtue and the structure of the universe, become more frequent. He was no longer trying to convince any particular duke. He was trying to understand his place in something much larger than any kingdom. What did it mean that he had failed? Not failed in teaching. His students were proof enough that the teaching worked, that individual transformation was possible, that Ren could be cultivated. But failed in politics, failed in the specific mission he had set himself, to restore the harmony of the Zhou through the reformation of government. That failure was undeniable. He was 70 years old, back in the small state where he had started, without office, without influence, without power. If his life had been only about gaining power, it would have been a tragedy without redemption. But Confucius had never been only about power. He had been about transmission, about ensuring that the wisdom of the ancients passed to the next generation, and the next, and the next. About creating not a government, but a lineage, a chain of students who would carry the teaching forward even when the teacher was gone. In his final years, this became his focus. He edited, he organized, he compiled the ancient texts that he had studied throughout his life, the songs, the histories, the records of ritual. He began to arrange them into teachable form. not writing new philosophy but curating the old, selecting what mattered most, creating a curriculum that could outlast him. He had failed to transform a single kingdom. He had lost his son and his two closest disciples. But in the quiet of his final years, Confucius was doing something that would prove more powerful than any government position. He was editing the books that would define Chinese civilization for millennia. The texts were ancient. Some of them predated Confucius by centuries. Songs sung at harvest before anyone could remember their origin. Records of kings who had ruled when the Zhou dynasty was young. Rituals whose meanings had been half forgotten even by the priests who performed them. They existed in scattered copies, in competing versions, in fragments that did not quite fit together. Confucius gathered them. He did not claim to be an author. He said famously that he transmitted but did not create. But transmission was itself a creative act, choosing which songs to include and which to exclude, deciding how the ritual should be organized, determining which historical records mattered and which could be discarded. These were choices that shaped what the past would mean for the future. The result was the 5 classics. The Book of Changes, the Yi Jing, was a divination manual, a system for understanding the patterns of cosmic transformation. Confucius studied it obsessively. In his final years, he said that if he had another 50 years to live, he would spend them on the changes, and he might finally come to understand it. The leather straps that bound his copy wore out 3 times from use. The Book of Documents, the Shujing, preserved the speeches and records of ancient kings. It provided models of good governance, examples of rulers who had served heaven and cared for their people. For anyone seeking to understand what a virtuous government looked like, this was the source. The Book of Songs, the Shijing, collected over 300 poems and hymns from across China, folk songs about love and loss, courtly odes praising noble deeds, ceremonial hymns for state occasions. Confucius believed these songs were morally instructive. They trained the emotions, refined sensibility, taught people how to feel appropriately. He said that anyone who studied the songs thoroughly would be fit to serve in government. The Book of Rites, the Liji, codified the ceremonies that Confucius had spent his life promoting. It explained not just what to do, but why, connecting each gesture to the meaning it embodied. This was the practical manual for living according to Li. The Spring and Autumn Annals, the Chunqiu, was a historical chronicle of Confucius's home state of Lu, covering the period from 722 to 481 BCE. On the surface, it was a dry record of events, births, deaths, invasions, treaties. But according to tradition, Confucius had embedded his moral judgments in the precise words he chose. A ruler described with one term was being praised. The same ruler described with a slightly different term was being condemned. The text was a coded ethical commentary, requiring careful study to decode. These 5 texts, together with the ANALECTS, which his disciples would compile after his death, became the foundation of Chinese education. For over 2,000 years, every scholar who sought government office studied them. Every examination tested knowledge of them. Every educated person could quote from them. They were not merely books. They were the shared intellectual inheritance of a civilization. Confucius did not write most of this material. He may not have written any of it in the strict sense, but by curating it, organizing it, attaching his name and authority to it, he ensured its survival. Other texts were lost, other traditions faded. The 5 classics endured because Confucius decided they should. This was his true legacy. Not the governments he failed to reform, but the curriculum he created for a culture that did not yet know it needed him. The classics would outlast dynasties, but there was one teaching, one single principle that would spread even further. It was so simple that a child could understand it, and it would appear in various forms in every major ethical tradition on earth. A disciple named Zigong once asked his teacher a question that cut through everything else. Is there a single word that can serve as a guide for one's entire life? The question was ambitious. A single word. Not a philosophy, not a system, not a library of texts. One word that could carry enough meaning to navigate every situation, every choice, every relationship a person would ever face. Confucius answered, "Shu." The word is usually translated as reciprocity, but that sounds too transactional. What Confucius meant was captured in the sentence that followed. Do not do to others what you would not want done to yourself. This is the golden rule. But notice the difference from the formulation most familiar to Western ears. The Christian version, appearing centuries later, would say, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." It is positive, commanding action. Confucius's version is negative, forbidding harm. The distinction matters. A positive rule tells you to act. If you want kindness, be kind. If you want generosity, be generous. This sounds inspiring, but it can become presumptuous. It assumes you know what others want, that your desires are universal, that your version of kindness is welcome everywhere. Confucius's formulation is humbler. It does not command you to do good, it commands you not to do harm. Before acting, ask, would I want this done to me? If the answer is no, stop. Do not steal, because you would not want to be stolen from. Do not deceive, because you would not want to be deceived. Do not humiliate, because you would not want to be humiliated. This is restraint, not assertion. It acknowledges that we may not know what others need, but we almost always know what they do not need. We know what hurts, what degrades, what violates. The negative formulation tells us to avoid these with certainty before venturing to guess what might help. Shu was not separate from Ren. It was Ren made practical, a person of full humanity naturally, treated others as worthy of the same consideration they desired for themselves. The two concepts interlocked. Ren was the quality, Shu was the method. If you wanted to cultivate Ren but did not know where to begin with Shu. Stop doing the things you would hate to have done to you. The rest would follow. Confucius did not claim to have invented this principle. He was transmitting, as always, drawing out something that was implicit in the ancient traditions, making it explicit and teachable. But by articulating it so clearly, by placing it at the centre of his ethics, he ensured that it would spread. The idea appeared independently in other traditions, which suggests something profound about its truth. The Jewish tradition had its own formulation. What is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbour. Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, each developed similar principles. When the same insight emerges across cultures, it is probably not arbitrary. It is probably touching something real about how human beings can live together without destroying each other. Confucius did not know that his formulation would be compared to teachings from other continents. He did not know that 2,500 years later, people would still be quoting it, debating it, trying to live by it. He knew only that it was true, and that if people followed it, the chaos he had witnessed all his life might finally end. He had given his life to teaching. He had failed to change a single government. He was about to die, but the disciples who surrounded him in those final days were carrying something in their memories, his words, his methods, his example, and they were about to write it all down. In his final years, Confucius spoke often of heaven. Not heaven as a place. He never described an afterlife, never promised rewards for the virtuous or punishments for the wicked. Heaven, for Confucius, was something closer to cosmic order. It was the structure of reality itself, the pattern that governed the turning of seasons and the fates of kingdoms. It was impersonal, but not indifferent. It could be trusted, even when it could not be understood. He believed that heaven had given him a task. The culture of the Zhou, the rituals, the music, the texts, the accumulated wisdom of centuries had been entrusted to him. Not because he was special, but because someone had to carry it. The chain of transmission could not be allowed to break. When the last person who understood the old ways died, the old ways would die with them. Confucius saw himself as a link in that chain, receiving from his predecessors and passing on to his successors. This was his mandate. He had not chosen it. Heaven had. The concept freed him from certain anxieties. If the mandate was real, then his failures were not entirely his fault. He had done what he could, taught what he knew, travelled where he could travel, spoken to whoever would listen. The results were not in his hands. Heaven would determine whether the culture survived. Heaven would raise up rulers who would listen, or it would not. Confucius could influence the outcome, but he could not control it. At 70, he said something that the ANALECTS recorded carefully. At 70, I could follow my heart's desire without overstepping the boundaries. This was not moral perfection in some absolute sense, it was alignment. After a lifetime of discipline, of training the heart through ritual and study, his desires had become trustworthy. What he wanted was what he should want. The struggle between impulse and duty, which defines most human lives, had dissolved. He had become what he taught. The young man who had mourned his mother for 3 years, who had taken humble jobs and asked questions of anyone who would answer, who had believed that virtue could transform the world. He had become an old man who no longer needed to fight himself. The cultivation was complete. Whatever happened next, he was ready. He did not know what would happen after death. He was famously reluctant to discuss the topic. When a disciple asked about serving the spirits of the dead, Confucius replied, "You're not yet able to serve the living. How could you serve the dead?" When asked about death itself, he said, "You do not yet understand life. How could you understand death?" This was not evasion. It was focus. The questions that mattered were questions about how to live. The afterlife, if there was one, would take care of itself. What required attention was the present, the students who still came, the texts that still needed editing, the rituals that still needed to be demonstrated correctly. The mandate would be fulfilled, or it would not. Heaven would decide. Confucius had done his part. At 72, his health began to fail. One morning, according to tradition, he woke from a dream and told his disciples it was time. He died soon after, quietly, having outlived most of those he loved. But his story was only beginning. The end came in 479 BCE. Confucius was 72 or 73 years old. The sources disagree on the precise calculation. He had been weakening for some time, the vigour that had carried him across China finally fading. The disciples who remained gathered around him in those final days, attending to a teacher who had spent his life attending to them. The records describe his last morning. He rose early, as he always did. He walked slowly, supporting himself to the door of his house. He stood there looking out and began to sing, a fragment of an old verse about a mountain crumbling, a beam rotting, a sage withering like a plant. One of his disciples heard and understood. The master, he said, must be about to die. Confucius did not deny it. He returned inside and sat facing the door, the position of a host receiving guests, the posture he had maintained for decades as students came to learn. 7 days later, he was gone. What happened next was the first proof that his teaching had taken root. His disciples mourned him, not briefly, not casually, not with the perfunctory grief that had become common. They mourned him properly. They wore the rough garments. They observed the restrictions. They did exactly what he had taught them to do when a beloved teacher died. Some of them stayed at his grave. A mourning hut was built near the burial site, and disciples took up residence there. They remained for 3 years. The same 3 years Confucius had given his mother, the period that symbolized the repayment of a debt that could never truly be repaid. For 3 years they lived in simplicity, honoring their teacher through the discipline of sustained grief. One disciple stayed longer. Zigong, the wealthy diplomat, the smooth talker whom Confucius had sometimes worried about, remained at the grave for 6 years. Whatever tensions had existed between them, whatever concerns Confucius had expressed about Zigong's tendency toward cleverness over substance, the disciple's devotion in the end was absolute. 6 years. twice the prescribed period and offering beyond any requirement. Around the grave, a small community formed. Students who had known Confucius personally, and students of students who had only heard the stories began to settle in the area. They built houses, they discussed the teachings, they started writing things down. Confucius had left behind no government, no laws, no army, no institution that bore his official authority. He left behind only people who remembered, people who had been changed by what they learned, people who were determined to ensure that what they had received would not vanish with their own deaths. He left behind only disciples with memories, but those memories would be written down, and that book, cobbled together from recollections, organised over generations, would become one of the most influential texts in human history. The book that would preserve Confucius was not written by Confucius. He left behind no treatise, no systematic exposition of his philosophy, no magnum opus that explained his ideas from first principles to final conclusions. What he left behind was disciples who remembered. In the years and decades after his death, those disciples began to write down what they had heard. They recorded conversations, sometimes in great detail, sometimes in fragments no longer than a sentence. They remembered questions they had asked and answers they had received. They recalled moments when the master had demonstrated a ritual, corrected an error, offered a cryptic observation that suddenly made sense years later. These fragments accumulated. Different disciples had different memories. Some had been present for conversations others had missed. Some remembered the exact words, others remembered only the gist. The material was scattered, unorganised, inconsistent. Over generations the fragments were collected, compared, arranged. The process was not systematic. There was no single editor, no authoritative version. Different schools of Confucian thought preserved different material. Eventually what emerged was the text known as the Lunyu, the ANALECTS. It is one of the strangest great books ever written. Open it anywhere and you will find discontinuity. A conversation about government sits next to an observation about music. A disciple asks a question. Confucius answers. The topic changes without transition. Some passages are profound, others seem trivial, some contradict others. The whole thing feels less like a book than like a box of notes recovered from a teacher's desk after his death. This apparent disorder was part of its power. A systematic treatise can be summarized, reduced to its main points, argued with directly. The ANALECTS resist this. Its fragmented form requires readers to assemble meaning for themselves, to hold different passages in mind simultaneously, to discover connections that the text does not make explicit. Studying the ANALECTS is not like reading a textbook. It is like having a conversation with someone who refuses to give you easy answers. For over 2,000 years this conversation continued. Students memorized the ANALECTS in childhood. Scholars spent lifetimes writing commentaries on its difficult passages. Emperors cited it to justify their policies. Rebels cited it to justify their resistance. The same text supported wildly different interpretations because the text itself was capacious enough to contain them all. The fragmentary nature of the book also preserves something essential about Confucius's method. He had always taught individually, tailoring his instruction to each student's needs. The ANALECTS preserves this. Different disciples asked similar questions and received different answers, not because Confucius was inconsistent, but because they needed different things. The book presents not a doctrine, but a practice, not a set of rules, but examples of how to apply judgment to specific situations. This is what the disciples saved. Not a philosophy in the abstract sense, but a way of thinking, a set of examples, a memory of how one person had responded to the challenges of being human. It was enough. It was more than enough. The ANALECTS was treasured by scholars, but scholars do not conquer empires. For Confucius's ideas to truly transform a civilization, they needed something more. They needed an emperor. For 3 centuries after Confucius died, his school was one among many. China had entered a period of extraordinary intellectual ferment, the 100 schools of thought, as later scholars would call it. Confucians competed with Taoists, who rejected the very idea of moral cultivation in favour of natural spontaneity. They competed with legalists, who dismissed virtue as irrelevant, and argued that only strict laws and harsh punishments could maintain order. They competed with mohists, followers of the philosopher Mozi, who advocated universal love and criticised Confucian rituals as wasteful. Each school had its adherents. Each claimed to offer the solution to China's chaos. None had achieved dominance when the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, unified the warring states in 221 BCE and created the first true Chinese empire. The Qin dynasty was not kind to Confucians. The emperor favoured legalism, a philosophy that concentrated all power in the state, demanded absolute obedience, and had no patience for scholars who quoted ancient texts about virtuous rulers. According to tradition, the emperor ordered Confucian books burned and Confucian scholars buried alive. Whether the accounts are exaggerated, the hostility was real. Confucianism survived the Qin, but barely. The Qin dynasty lasted only 15 years before collapsing into rebellion. What replaced it would change everything. The Han dynasty, established in 206 BCE, needed to govern an empire, and governing an empire required something the legalists could not provide. It required legitimacy. It required a shared set of values that could justify the emperor's authority and provide a moral framework for the massive bureaucracy that administered the realm. It required educated officials who could be trusted to make decisions in distant provinces without direct supervision. The Confucians offered exactly this. In 136 BCE, Emperor Wu made it official. He established an imperial academy where the 5 classics, the texts Confucius had edited and transmitted, became the core curriculum. He decreed that candidates for government positions would be tested on their knowledge of these classics. The examination system that would define Chinese governance for the next 2,000 years was born. This was the moment Confucius became immortal. His philosophy was no longer one option among many. It was the official ideology of the largest empire on earth. To become an official, to gain power, prestige, wealth, you had to master what Confucius had taught. The texts he had preserved became the common language of the educated class. The values he had championed became the stated values of the state. Generation after generation, young men across China memorized the ANALECTS. They learned about Ren and Li, about the Junzi and the Xiaoren, about filial piety and the rectification of names. They absorbed these concepts in childhood and carried them through their lives. Whether they believed them sincerely or cynically, they knew them. The vocabulary of Confucianism became the vocabulary of Chinese thought. The irony was profound. Confucius had spent his life trying to advise rulers, to reform governments, to transform states through virtue. Every ruler had rejected him. Now, centuries after his death, his ideas were being imposed from the top down by emperors who had never met him, who could not know whether they were interpreting him correctly, who were using his name to legitimize their own power. Would Confucius have approved? The sources do not tell us. He had wanted virtuous rulers, not merely rulers who quoted him. He had wanted genuine transformation, not mere lip service. But the transformation was real, even if imperfect. Values shape behaviour even when the behaviour falls short. For 2,000 years, through the Tang, the Song, the Ming, the Qing, Confucianism remained the foundation of Chinese governance. But empires rise and fall. The question was whether the ideas could outlast the system that enforced them. The ideas did not stop at the borders of China. Korea adopted Confucianism during the Three Kingdoms period, centuries before Korea was unified. The Joseon dynasty, which ruled from 1392 to 1897, made it the official state ideology, more strictly, some historians argue, than China itself ever had. The examination system, the ancestor rituals, the emphasis on filial piety, All of it was transplanted and adapted. Korean society was reorganized around Confucian principles. The effects endure to this day. Japan received Confucianism through Korea and China, absorbing it alongside Buddhism and indigenous Shinto beliefs. During the Tokugawa shogunate, which lasted from 1603 to 1868, Confucianism provided the ethical framework for the samurai class. The concepts of loyalty, duty, and proper relationships, transformed, certainly, but recognizably Confucian, shaped Japanese culture for centuries. Vietnam, under Chinese influence for a millennium, adopted the examination system and the classical curriculum. Vietnamese scholars wrote in Chinese characters and quoted the ANALECTS. Independence from China did not mean independence from Confucius. The ideas had become part of what it meant to be educated. This was an empire of influence that no army had conquered. Confucius never travelled outside the small region of China where he was born. He never imagined that his ideas would shape civilizations he'd never heard of, in languages he could not have spoken. But the transmission continued, from teacher to student, from text to reader, across borders and centuries. European missionaries encountered Confucianism in the 16th and 17th centuries and were fascinated. They translated the classics into Latin, sent reports back to Europe, debated whether Confucius was compatible with Christianity. Voltaire and other Enlightenment thinkers held up China as an example of rational governance, citing Confucian principles to criticize European monarchy and religion. The examination system impressed European reformers who were trying to modernize their own governments. The idea of selecting officials based on merit rather than birth, an idea Confucius had championed 25 centuries earlier, found new advocates in countries that had never heard of the Analects. In the 20th century, Confucianism faced its greatest challenge. The Chinese Revolution of 1949 brought to power a government officially committed to Marxism. The new regime attacked Confucianism as feudal superstition, as an ideology that had kept China backward while other nations industrialized. During the Cultural Revolution, Red Guards destroyed temples, burned classical texts, persecuted scholars. Confucius was denounced as a reactionary whose ideas had poisoned China for millennia. The destruction was real. The institutions that had preserved Confucianism for 2,000 years were dismantled. The examination system had already been abolished in 1905. Now the temples were closed, the texts suppressed, the very name of Confucius made shameful. And yet, the ideas proved harder to eliminate than the institutions. Family structures still reflected Confucian values. Attitudes toward education, toward respect for elders, toward the relationship between individual and society, these did not vanish because the government declared them obsolete. The Cultural Revolution ended. China opened. Confucius institutes now spread Chinese language and culture around the world, reclaiming a name that had briefly been forbidden. In the 21st century, Confucius is being rediscovered. Confucius Institute spread his language across the globe. Scholars debate his relevance to modern ethics. And perhaps most remarkably, the questions he asked 2,500 years ago still do not have easy answers. Let us return to where we began. A man walks from kingdom to kingdom, carrying nothing but his ideas and a small band of students. He offers his services to every ruler he meets. He explains how society could be transformed, how violence could end, how order could emerge from chaos through the cultivation of virtue. One by one, they refuse him. Some are polite, some are hostile, none are persuaded. 14 years of this, dozens of courts, hundreds of conversations, and in the end, nothing, no position, no power, no implementation of the philosophy he had spent his life developing. He returns home, an old man, to teach whoever will still listen. He buries his son. He loses his favourite disciple. He watches as the world continues its chaos, its violence, its refusal to learn. When he dies, he leaves behind no government, no institution, no lasting structure. He leaves behind only students and memories, fragments of conversation, demonstrations of ritual, a curriculum of ancient texts. And yet, 2,000 years later, more than 2 billion people live in societies shaped by his ideas. The examination system he inspired selected officials for the longest-lasting government in human history. His concepts became so fundamental to East Asian thought that people who have never read a word he wrote still carry his assumptions about family, education and proper conduct. The ANALECTS remains one of the most translated, most studied, most quoted books ever produced. How does this happen? The question that opened this documentary has no single answer, but it has pieces. Confucius was rejected because his ideas demanded long-term thinking in a world that could only see the next battle. Rulers wanted techniques for immediate victory. He offered the slow, difficult work of self-cultivation and institutional reform. They wanted magic. He offered practice. He was rejected because his teaching was implicitly critical of those in power. The rectification of names, the distinction between the Junzi and the XIAO, the insistence that authority must be earned through virtue. These were not compliments to rulers who had seized power through force. He was offering a mirror. They did not want to look. But rejection did not mean failure. It meant that his ideas remained pure, unpolluted by the compromises that power always demands. Because he never governed, he never had to make the ugly choices that governing requires. His philosophy remained an ideal, a standard against which reality could be measured and found wanting. His students preserved what he taught. Not perfectly. The ANALECTS is a patchwork, a reconstruction, full of gaps and contradictions, but they preserved enough. And when the Han Dynasty needed a moral framework for an empire, when they needed a philosophy that could legitimate authority, while also constraining it, the Confucian texts were ready. The institutional adoption transformed everything. What had been one school among many became the official ideology. What had been optional became required. Generations of students absorbed the ideas not because they were convinced, but because advancement demanded it. And over centuries the absorption became genuine. The vocabulary of Confucius became the vocabulary of Chinese civilization. This was not what Confucius had planned. He had wanted to transform a single state through his own efforts, to demonstrate that virtue worked, to see the results in his own lifetime. What he got was something stranger, a posthumous conquest he never intended and could not have imagined. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing to The Long Shadow. We explore the lives that continue shaping the world we live in, and I'm curious, what part of Confucius's story changed how you see him? Let me know in the comments. The final lesson may be the strangest of all. Success and influence are not the same thing. A life can fail by every immediate measure: rejection, poverty, obscurity, death in disappointment, and still reshape the world. The seed planted in the wrong season can still germinate, years or centuries later, when the soil is finally ready. Confucius believed that heaven had given him a mandate to preserve and transmit the culture of the Zhou. He believed he had failed. He was wrong. 2,500 years later, we are still trying to answer the question a failed advisor asked in a courtyard in Lu. What kind of person should I become? The fact that we are still asking may be the truest measure of his success. And so our story of Confucius comes to a close. It has been a true pleasure to be your guide through the life of this remarkable teacher. Thank you for listening. Until our next journey into the past, I wish you a calm and peaceful night.